With more than 2 decades working at Nasdaq, our next guest is not only responsible for the successful listing of hundreds of companies, he also has plenty of inside experience from the roller coaster ride of what we usually call the stock market. Here to provide expert insights on the current market climate and financing trend is Adam Kostyál, Head of Listings at Nasdaq. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Adam, first of all, market conditions have changed a lot since 2021. What would you say are the main implications for companies seeking to raise capital in this current climate?
Well, there's many implications for companies in this climate. I mean, you have both aspect that you have many companies that were ready to list this year, which of course now have to rethink their plans, which is fundamental. It's a bit like extending the finish line of a marathon after having run 42 kilometers, and you tell them that all of a sudden the marathon is 42 more kilometers. But there are many options for companies, of course. The private markets are a bit stronger than before, but overall the expectations have to be realigned. So many companies are in the position that they need to refinance their growth, and the question is where they do that. So the lack of the support of the exchange right now is concerning for many of the companies, and you will probably see many of the listed companies do new emissions directed to existing shareholders. And then you will see the other companies having to look for alternatives because the exchange is not really there to support them right now. So it is a bit concerning. We are, of course, hoping that this is a period of volatility which will go over. But the reality is probably that this will stay with us for a bit longer. So we are following this closely, and many companies are impacted. But we are seeing that within the biotech sector that there are some companies that have raised significant amounts of money. So I think it's individual by company, but overall a lot more volatile.
Having helped so many companies to enter the stock market over the years, how important would you say that the general market climate is for a successful IPO?
I think it's sometimes a bit more exaggerated, because at the end of the day you're looking at the long-term journey of a company, not only on the day of the IPO. So at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of exaggeration about the start. Having said that, you never want a bad start. So at the end of the day, I think you have to realign what the expectations are in terms of valuations. And I think that's what's going on now. I think the next companies to come out should not expect the same valuations as before. And probably you need to also rethink how much you want to sell on the day of IPO. So from that perspective, too much focus on the day of the start. More focus should be put on the value of being a listed company over time. But right now, I think it's a bit too much to expect that companies should push out in this volatile market. So I think it's probably right to wait a bit, but maybe realign on valuations, get a less dramatic start, and focus on the long-term value of being a listed company.
2021 was somewhat of a record year in terms of IPO activity. And now, are there still a lot of companies in line waiting to enter the stock market? And how do you at Nasdaq deal with the pent-up demand?
Well, first of all, I think there was already a readjustment in the biotech sector earlier in 2021. So we started already seeing quite a sort of a less activity on the biotech side, and the valuations were already correcting themselves before what we saw now with the geopolitical and inflationary driven volatile market that we're experiencing right now. So I think there was already a correction going on in the biotech sector. Having said that, going into 2022, we had in the US more than 270 companies that were ready to go to the market that had filed. Many of these are biotech companies. In the Nordic markets, we of course have been supporting smaller, mid-sized companies. We saw a great interest there for new companies to come into the market. Of course, that pipeline has calmed down quite dramatically. How we're dealing with it, we're keeping a very tight dialogue with the advisors and the companies. From our perspective, it is an issue because we know that there's a lot of science and a lot of innovation that has to be financed. There will be a repercussion of that perspective. I think many of these companies would seek the potential to be acquired by larger companies, which is a missed opportunity in many ways, because I think on a standalone basis, some of these companies would have done very well. But overall, there is a big up demand. We can't do much. We're hoping that the markets realign and that they find a better dialogue with their investors in terms of finding a better starting position going into 2022. Having said that, I don't think 2022 is going to be a dramatic IPO year. So we are looking at maybe 2023 to be realistic. The other aspect is that we're happily seeing that many companies that are listed with us being able to refinance and support their continued growth. So it's a balancing act, but overall a lot less activity. We can't do much. We stay close to the companies.
This is hardly the first time that you have seen a shaky market put a wet blanket on the IPO activity. But from your perspective and your experience, what do you think needs to happen for the general investor sentiment to change?
Well, I think no one has really experienced what we're experiencing now. I think inflation is one thing that we could have dealt with. I think the geopolitical dimensions of what we're experiencing is something that very few of us have experienced in combination with the high inflation, or rather the expected inflation growth. So from that perspective, we are in new territory for many. And to say that this is comparable to previous examples is not really fair. Having said that, I think there are many parameters that make us more comfortable. There are very much stronger fundamentals. There is no systematic failures in the markets. And I think within the biotech sector, I think there has to be maybe a correction on valuations and expectations. So I think companies have to be a bit more credible in terms of what they want to achieve, because the market will not price sort of high expectations or over-dimensioned expectations. So I think this rebalancing might not necessarily be unhealthy, but of course we don't want this window to be closed for too long, because then we're not financing growth and innovation, and that has to be taking place. And there the exchange plays a fundamental role, especially for this sector. So difficult to predict, but I'm hoping that we will find more stability towards the end of the year or already after the summer. If that takes place, I'm sure the IPO window will open up.
So refinancing life science companies clearly is challenging these days. What's your advice to the companies and to investors who might be facing now lower valuations and higher dilution due to the current market conditions?
Very difficult advice to give, and of course each company is separate from the other. Having said that, I think what is fantastic is, at least in the Nordic markets as well, we have very strong and very sophisticated and also, I would say, experienced investors that know their companies well. I think they're seeing right now that they have to free up cash to support the further growth of some of their investments. Not all companies will succeed with their refinance. So I think we have to be prepared for some failures or some realigned expectations. But overall, making sure that you are staying close to your investors, making sure that you're realigning expectations in terms of growth. Those are the key aspects that you need to filter in. But finding new investors at this time is very challenging. And I would make sure that you spend more time with existing and realigning expectations and overall dimensions in terms of valuations. So from that perspective, I'm hoping that many of our companies will be able to refinance, but we're also prepared for the fact that many might not be able to meet the expectations. So overall, we're hoping for a positive outcome.
Thank you very much for being with us today, Adam.
Thank you.